Hey guys, Michael J. Crawford, the Anti-Trekker here, and today's going to be a fairly quick video, mainly because I got a lot that I'm working on, particularly for Halloween night. Mrs. Anti-Trekker has recorded a special review of The Hellbound Heart, the book that Hellraiser was based on, and so I'm hoping to get that up for Halloween night. Look forward to that on Wednesday. I'm also working on the next part of the Scorpion review for the Borg series, so that's a big one that's coming out this week, and other goodies as time permits. But today, I really quickly want to address the next component of our Star Wars Star Trek battle, which is actually a fairly straightforward and simple one, which is why I think this video will be relatively short. And that is firepower. There's been a lot argued back and forth between the nerds over the years about the relative firepower of an Imperial Star Destroyer versus a Federation starship. Now, most of the time, the Star Wars argumentation revolves around one particular shot from one particular film, and that is this. So, what we see here is the Star Destroyer effectively vaporizing small asteroids in order to clear their path through an asteroid field. And while many Star Trek fans try to argue, yeah, but what about this?
It was the last time
the typical response from the Star Wars fans is, well, that's after they sustained heavy damage and all that, and obviously their shields were down and blah, 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 blah. Well, first of all, I'm going to call BS on that because, number one, that is what we see in the story of Empire Strikes Back is when the Star Destroyers first enter the asteroid field, immediately one of the Star Destroyers is destroyed. That shot of the rock hitting the bridge of a Star Destroyer is the first time we see the Star Destroyers in the asteroid field. Later in the film, we see the Star Destroyers blasting the rocks. So it's not like, and granted, they did say we've sustained damage, but at the same time, I really doubt that they were pelted with millions upon millions of rocks to wear down their shields. It just seems like this rock was big enough to be too much for the shields to handle. But that's not even the argument I'm making here. Basically, what people have been trying to argue is the insane amount of firepower of a turbolaser in order to vaporize this rock. And granted, that's a lot of firepower. It's certainly more firepower than most people could muster today short of a nuclear explosion. It does seem to pretty much disintegrate that rock in short order. And I am not even going to try to dismiss the size of the rock and say that it's a tiny little boulder or something. Based on the size of the Star Destroyer, and I know we got to kind of take into account the perspective of the shot and everything, I would say that it's safe to bet that those asteroids were at least 100 or 200 meters across. And so that is no small feat to vaporize those asteroids. Now, all that being said, the primary argument from the Star Wars side of things is that this is absolute proof that the weaponry of the Empire is far superior to anything that the Federation can muster in terms of raw firepower. And since Imperial ships and also Alliance ships are capable of withstanding hits from said weapons, you could also logically extrapolate that the armor of said ships are much, much tougher. And further, based on this incredible firepower and that shields are effective at all in the Star Wars universe, although quite frankly, until The Last Jedi, we've never really seen shields be effective in the Star Wars universe, but that's a whole other argument. The fact is that this must be absolute proof that, like, Federation shields, Federation weapons, and Federation armor are all clearly inferior to the Imperial side of this fight. Which, okay, I can see that argument, except that it's complete and utter bullshit. And the reason that it is complete and utter bullshit is not because any of what they demonstrated I'm going to prove false, but rather they're simply not taking into account what we've seen on the other side of this battle. Namely, once again, Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Power systems.
Navigation detectors inoperative, Captain. Direction control also inoperative.
The
Mr. Chekhov, stand by on phasers. No! Arm photon torpedoes!
Objective an asteroid reading Mach 0.7.
Fire torpedoes!
So in this sequence from Star Trek The Motion Picture, the Enterprise fires a single photon torpedo and obliterates a rather sizable asteroid. Now, we don't know the exact measurements of the asteroid. We can't compare apples to apples as far as that's concerned. However, based on what we see on screen, I would dare argue that the asteroid that was destroyed by the Enterprise was significantly larger than the one destroyed by the Star Destroyers. The reason being that we see that the photon torpedo takes 4 seconds to travel, and we've already established that the relative speed of a photon torpedo is some 14,000 kilometers per second. So that means that the relative distance of this asteroid is probably somewhere in the order of about 50,000 kilometers away. And yet it's still visible to the naked eye and quite sizable, which means it should be thousands of meters across at the very least. Now, I'm not going to try to argue that the photon torpedo is many, many times more destructive than turbolasers. I'm simply pointing out that you cannot dismiss the firepower of the Enterprise by trying to say that they blew up a smaller rock. Because from all that we see on screen for both Empire Strikes Back, where the rocks are in the foreground and yet appear, even if they were orthographic with the Star Destroyer, to be no more than 100, 200 meters across, compared to the rock in the Star Trek The Motion Picture is in the background and some 50,000 kilometers away and yet still visible to the naked eye. I would say that there's no case to be made that the Star Trek rock was smaller. Now, you could argue about the relative size of the Imperial rocks because we have no way to gauge the actual range other than the fact that we know that it's pretty darn close, but I'm not going to even try to fight that because it's a wasted exercise. The point of this is not to say that Federation weapons are superior in firepower to the Empire. It's that they are at least equal. And by the way, I know that the standard argumentation to come about my comparison, since my battle is about a Constitution class, is that, well, this is once again the upgraded Constitution refit from the films, not the original Constitution from the original series, which is very much true. Another comparison that people try to make is that I'm not talking about phasers, I'm talking about torpedoes, which is also true. However, that being said, we also know that Kirk, who is in command of the Enterprise at this point, has never served aboard a refit Enterprise and in fact is going by what he understands of the old Constitution class, as he is later corrected by Decker in that the reason they launched a torpedo as opposed to Kirk's initial order asking for phasers, is that phasers had been improved by channeling their power directly from the warp drive. Now, Kirk did not know this, which means that as far as Kirk was concerned, the phaser systems that he was ordering to evaporate this rock was in fact the same as the phaser systems that he was used to from the Constitution class, which means that, at least in the minds of James D. Kirk, the original Enterprise phasers were more than enough for the job. And there is no indication whatsoever that photon torpedoes had changed at this point. In fact, you could make the argument that the torpedoes are not changed until Star Trek II, because this is the last time we see the blue photon torpedo. And photon torpedoes were blue in the original series. So in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, they changed them to red, which I think was a mistake from a aesthetic point of view. I think the blue looks better, but hey, I'm not the boss, so I don't get to make that decision. All I'm saying is that if the weapons are relatively equal and that we've seen both the Federation and the Imperial weapons vaporize an asteroid, then that would also indicate that since said weapons are both relatively effective in their relative universes, that their armor is probably relatively equal. We also know from Star Trek terms that shields are pretty effective in protecting against blasts from photon torpedoes. In fact, what you want to do, the basic strategy, is that you wear down the shields by phaser fire and then you destroy the ship with a photon. However, that's not, Star Wars is totally different. In Star Wars, shields seem to work differently in that they don't truly block incoming fire as much as reduce it when it's energy based. However, some damage seems to get through. Now, the problem is that there with shields, it's going to be very difficult to come up with any real numbers because honestly, in both the original series Star Trek and in Star Wars, we never really see what the shields are capable of directly. We see some indirect things. We have references to shields being used. For example, on the Millennium Falcon, they say angle the deflector shield, but we never really see the deflector shield being effective at anything. In the original series of Star Trek, we just see enemy bolts and torpedoes and stuff hitting the Enterprise and them talking about the shields weakened, but we don't see exactly what the shields are capable of taking and stopping. Although in the Changeling episode that I used for my first example, they did say that the shields took a hit of 90 photon torpedoes and drained the shields 20%. So at least on the Star Trek side, you could say that assuming that turbolasers hit with approximately the same force as a photon torpedo, that it would take 450 direct hits from turbolasers to penetrate Federation shields. As far as how many shots from a phaser bank would take to take out the Imperial shields, I don't know. We don't have enough on-screen evidence to say one way or the other. However, based on the way the battles tend to go in Star Wars, I'm going to say 450 or less would be more than enough to penetrate Imperial shields and take out. And the biggest difference between Imperial shields and Federation is that you have these giant balls on top of Star Destroyers that if you take those out, the shields go down completely. But that's another story for another video when we start talking about tactics between the two ships. Anyway, until next time, take care.